everyone. I'm Darian Gold, and welcome to All Things Pilates Season 6. As we dig deeper into the life of a contrologist, this season's guest list shares what the Pilates methodology can offer to anyone who desires health and wellness. On this show, we'll explore, seek, and investigate what's possible when we incorporate contrology into our lives. On this 100th episode of All Things Pilates, I wanted to present something a little different for you. Last year, Gareth Cornwall, a psychotherapist, who is our guest today, sent me an email expressing his appreciation for this podcast. It got me thinking about the role our psychology plays in the health of our body. And I wondered how Gareth might have treated someone like Joseph Pilates, who experienced so much childhood trauma and adversities later in life. So, on this special episode, Gareth will take us through some of the process of what it might have been like had he treated or even just made observations about Joseph Pilates. As Gareth says, part of reclaiming life after trauma is a return to control. And certainly, contrology seems to have a really positive impact on that journey. Gareth, welcome to the show as a guest, not as a listener.
Thank you, Darren. I'm delighted to be here, and we should mark this episode. It's the 100th episode.
Yes.
So that's a special occasion, and hopefully we'll get a few moments at the end of the conversation to ask you a few questions about that.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Gareth, I mentioned in how Joseph Pilates had a lot of trauma, as most of us have read in various books. Most likely he never dealt with any of it. How do you define trauma?
Well, I think it's useful to define it right at the start, because obviously it's a word that's used a lot. It's bandied around a lot, isn't it? And it's become increasingly popular, I think, as well. And you think about a very essential definition of trauma as a wound. And really, the origins of it came more from a physical position than a mental position. So the idea of a physical or emotional pain, and that's a very essential definition, the idea of being wounded, if you like. Now, wounds come in many forms and varieties, don't they? So, a cut on your finger is a wound, but actually, breaking a leg's a wound, suffering a heavy blow is a wound. Lots of different ways we can be wounded, physically and mentally. And really in the trauma literature, often what we see is the idea that it's not the extent of the wound, how we cope and how we adapt as a result of it. So a few useful quotes, perhaps. Gabor Mate, the Canadian psychiatrist, says, trauma is not what happens to you, trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. Bessel van der Kolk, you might have heard of, Body Keeps the Score author.
Oh, yeah.
Trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people.
Oh, yes.
So you get that idea that things happen to us all the time. That's part of life. It's really about how do those adversities affect us? Do we carry them forward? Do we internalize them, carry them into ourselves? How do we adapt to them? Do we adapt healthily or unhealthily? And actually, how do we deal with life's challenges and adversities and horrors as well?
Can someone go through a traumatic experience and figure it out on their own so that they don't carry the kind of trauma forward? Or do they need professional help?
No, I think you think about human evolution, we're kind of evolved to deal with challenges. What happens sometimes is those challenges become stuck. It could be because they're too intense. The scale of the challenge overwhelms our ability to respond. It could be because at that point of trauma, we're particularly vulnerable. So often in childhood, we can see the impacts of trauma. Sometimes we call that complex trauma. When you have trauma throughout your childhood, that can leave very deep scars. But the ability to bounce back, to respond, to adapt, to change is possible. And in the trauma community, we talk about post-traumatic growth sometimes, the fact that people can emerge from trauma with a degree of growth and learning. And obviously that's a healthy outcome, a healthy adaptation, if you like. Often what happens is that people can internalize that trauma, which you get from that idea of the quotes we've just looked at. And it starts to affect their sense of self or their sense of other people or their sense of the world. And certainly when we look at Joe in his later life, which we'll touch on in the conversation, we can start to see some of the imprints of that.
Well, I love your quote. Part of reclaiming life after trauma is a return to control. And certainly contrology seems to have a really positive impact on that journey. And contrology entered your life how and when?
Yeah, so I knew it was Pilates at that point, and I had cancer a few years ago, and went through pretty extensive surgery and chemotherapy, and came out medically cancer-free, but I suppose psychologically, physically quite broken by the whole experience. And looking at some of the literature, I suppose that I was reading, I was kind of researching away, what should I do now? Because you finish treatment and it's kind of, thank you very much. Bye.
Do they just toss you up?
Yeah,
toss you out?
a very common experience, I think, for people in my situation, certainly in the UK. So I researched and I kept on finding references to Pilates. And in the trauma literature, there's lots of references to yoga. And I've come to see that the reason that yoga is often referenced in the trauma literature is just simply because at the point when people started to research, it was more visible and more popular. That, they're different practices, obviously, but they share many essential elements. So I looked around where I live. I live in Dorking in Surrey in England. And I found a studio called Fit Physio, they're called, in Westcott, little village. And I just booked an appointment and I went in, and my first instructor is called Robin, and she was fabulous. She was able to really read my body, see what was happening for me at that time, and really gently introduce me into reformer. And so I started off, one-on-one.
How long after post-surgery?
I think that was probably, what would it have been? Actually, about 8 months, 9 months afterwards. Yeah. So, and that practice, it's very gentle. I had a stoma reversed, so I had a very kind of quite a big abdominal scar. The muscle had been cut through, so we needed to be careful. But actually, I did the one-on-one classes. I went into the group classes, and that's a practice that I've adopted since. And I go several times a week, and I love it. And it's always hard, isn't it, to say what helps and what doesn't. But that sense of connection that comes in a Pilates class, and the sense of movement, the sense of freedom, the sense of mindfulness, the precision, the control, the routine, all of these elements for me is incredibly powerful. And anecdotally, when I speak to people, I met people that have the same experience as me, and that ability to go into a class, and often
you mean from cancer to
or from other life traumas, I mean, everybody carries element
definitely
challenge, but that sense of you know what it's like. You go to a class and people kind of grumble and moan when they go in, and we come out
and they're happy
afterwards, and it's that amazing feeling, and it brings you back. It brings you back, and it brings you back. For me, that sense of bringing me back, and that book, Return to Life, is a very apt title. That sense of how do I live now? Well, this Pilates for me has been a part of how do I live now. It's part of that return to life. It's being able to feel connected again. And, from a psychological point of view, I can see that it has many characteristics that support connection, which is very important in recovery from trauma. A sense of safety, sense of community, and that control over the body. So for me, it's something that I think has a real healing potential in terms of trauma. I think for people that are experiencing lots of life stress, it's got a very protective element to it as well. It isn't just about recovery, it's also about protection, I think, and the protective characteristics of being able to, replenish and decompress.
Even though it's been a few years, right? Do you recall what stood out right away in your whole physical, mental body experience when you had your maybe first lesson, your fifth lesson? What did you feel different?
I mean, I went into this studio and there are not many men that go to Pilates studios, if I'm honest. So I was kind of this.
Oh, that's changing a lot.
It's still about, maybe
70-30.
Yeah, it's maybe in England it's like 20-80, it's kind of, So I walked in and I was really unsure what this was. And I think I remember getting a tour around the studio and seeing all these strange machines and thinking, is this the right place? And feeling very out of touch with my body. You know, I mean, when you have a serious illness, you're out of touch with your body. I mean, really, you know, you're out of control and you're controlled by other people. And at points, you know, you physically can't, I couldn't, you know, I was kind of in a bed for a while and I couldn't walk easily and I had bags and all this kind of stuff. So that sense of regaining some control over my body, that was almost immediate, I think, that sense of, okay, I can have some control over my body. And from a psychological point of view, from the mind, I think that ability to be able to be in the moment. And in fact, I was in class the other day and, you know, somebody's having a very difficult time with their daughter. You know, she's just going through an ADHD diagnosis. There's a lot of stress in the family. And she said to me, this is keeping me together at the moment because for this class, I don't have to think about that. I'm just thinking about my body. I'm just thinking about the next movement, just thinking about my breath. And that ability to decompress.
It's powerful.
Oh, really, really. And, you know, I mean, also it says something about that community that we feel free to share that sort of thing too. And that's another real value, I think, of the practice, that it builds community.
Agreed, completely. In Eva Rinke's book, Joseph Pilates, a biography, she covers a number of experiences that Joe had as a child, as well as when he was interned on the Isle of Man during World War I. And we can also cite John Steele's book and how he describes what was going on with Joe in New York at his Contrology studio. How might Joe have benefited from therapy?
Yeah, it's interesting to, you know, those are two great sources. I think Eva's book's a really fantastic biographical source. You know, there's a lot of detail there about his life and plenty of you know, firsthand testimonies. And John Steele's book, you know, somebody who knew him really well, and it's a very, I think, a really interesting read about his character, particularly, you know, later in life. And I think what you see with Joe is this idea of how do we develop as a person? How do we cope? How do we cope with life? You know, life's thrown at us in a way, and we develop a way of coping. And Joe's way from a very early age was he was a fighter. You know, and you see that, don't you? The fact that he's got these physical health problems when he's a child, that he has, you know, rickets, and he has issues with his body.
Lungs.
Yeah. He's got physical issues and he's bullied for that. He's bullied for the fact it's called Pilates, you know, and he gets all this Pontius Pilate stuff thrown at him.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, there's his father in the background who's a physical man, who's a part of that body culture movement in Germany at that time, part of the sports club movement. And his salvation is his body. And I see that coping style throughout his life. The signature coping style is, I revert to my body. And, you know, there's a line in Eva's book, his new body meant a lot to Joseph Pilates. It was a kind of personal triumph. It was important for him to have discovered the source of internal strength. And that sense, you know, he discovered his body and his body is his salvation. And you see that, you know, these adversities, the challenges of, you know, losing his mother young, the challenges of losing his
siblings,
son, you know, and siblings, losing his son, the challenges of being interned, you know, for a long period of time in England. And the salvation is always back to the body, you know, and also historically, this kind of hyperinflation in Germany that's going on, the loss of the First World War, you know, he goes to America just at the point of the Depression. There's all this stuff happening around him. And it's always back to the body. It's back to the body. And his combativeness, this, people describe him now, they're drill sergeant and a fighter. This word fighter comes out so often. So I think that was how it was this, you know, gymnastics and boxing started it. And then he developed Pilates and that became his obsession. John Steele's book's fascinating, you know, when he goes around to the apartment and they're sitting around having dinner and they're all sat on wonder chairs, you know? And he says to them, sit on this V bed, and he nearly falls into it, you know, the reformer in the corner and a Cadillac in the other corner. And it's his obsession. And I think it was his hinterland, it was his everything. I think, and the story of the fire, I think later, you know, in the studio in the 60s, I think this was, which John Steele documents that, you know, which ruined his lungs, that the fire is raging and the firemen are throwing the furniture out the window, and he gets a stick and he fights them off. You know, he's a fighter. So to answer your question about therapy and Joe, in psychology, we think of the fact you can have constructive anger. Okay, constructive anger changes the world, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
So anger as an emotion can be incredibly
Powerful.
powerful, yeah. I mean, Martin Luther King, channeled his anger, didn't he? Gandhi channeled his anger. If you look at the women's rights movements, there's a huge history of people channeling anger. So anger, when it's constructive, can be very useful. When it becomes destructive, it becomes something that starts to break down relationships, it starts to break down ambitions, it starts to become incredibly corrosive. And I think with Joe, what we see really in that seminal period in the 1950s when he worked with Eva Gentry, I think we see the switch from a constructive anger that had driven him, the drive to establish Pilates, the drive.
And to prove himself and to prove that his system is a lifesaver.
Yes, yes. And that was driving him, this thing about the studio, but actually from that point, it's quite seminal, I think, for him, as something takes place inside him. Again, this idea of the self and the others in the world. There's a change that takes place, and that anger becomes destructive from the kind of late 50s, mid-late 50s onwards. And in the books, that's quite telling. So I think if you think about his life, and this was, you could equate it. I think I was talking to somebody the other day, and it was all like saying this is the person that created the piano, in the sense you can play many tunes on a piano. And on a reformer, you can do many different things and many different guises of it. So he created something quite amazing and believed in it totally. And that frustration eventually that tipped into a destructive anger, and that that made perhaps the end of his life less happy for him than he deserved, actually. And I think that's where therapy might have helped him, is to come to terms with that anger, to manage it maybe better, and to be able to, because
he wasn't getting the acknowledgement and the respect that he rightfully deserved from the medical profession.
Yeah. And in that story, I think that in the Eva Gentry story, there's Eva Gentry who has worked with him for a long time, who has, a very serious
mastectomy,
cancer.
Right?
Yeah, has a pec major removed, which by all rights should mean that she can't do an awful lot.
Lift her arm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and actually he does a year's worth of work with her, and I found the video of it on YouTube.
Yes,
yes, and it's great
on the petty pole.
Yeah, it's great to watch, because you get the sense of him and his utter absorption in the process, and her actually utter adoration of him too, in terms of his genius. So her husband films this. They go to the doctors. They show the video, and the doctors say to them, "Well, this is a fraud. This is a fraud because it's not possible." And so they go back again. He's a fighter. They go back again, and Bruce films it again, except this time he films Eve
naked.
Yeah. So, and then they go back, and the doctors say, "This is amazing. We need to establish a rehab program. This is going to be transformative." So Joe is going to get what he always wanted, which was this acknowledgement, this recognition. And then they say, "Well, can we just have your qualifications?" And he says, "Well, I don't have any qualifications." And as Eva says, Joe had no alphabet after his name.
Right.
And actually at that point he's rejected. And John Howard Steele says, "I believe this was his most painful rebuke."
I'm sure.
This
whole culmination of his work right there with Eve Gentry, truly.
Yeah. And the power, everything, the power to change, the power to really have an impact. So the fulfillment of all of his ambitions in this moment, rejected by the medical establishment, with no hope of that being reversed unless he suddenly, in his 70s, garners all these qualifications. And it seeps, I think it really seeps in, and it has a profound effect. And you start to see this effect through his relationships. So, there's people trying to establish groups and committees to help further Pilates. He becomes very angry, storms out, "You're stealing my ideas and I'm still alive." I think in terms of interpersonal relationships, there starts to be a lot of anger.
He had none.
No. And you get that sense of, him going and people setting things up, people setting up these lovely meetings for him, trying to help move him forward, and him being rude to people because actually he's so frustrated with what's going on for him.
Totally. Even when he expressed his frustration with basically everyone who wasn't in his world, they didn't understand his life's work. And there's a part in, I think it's Eva's book, that he wrote 2 letters to the young president, John F. Kennedy, urging him to consider Contrology literally as the savior of America. That's another substantial rejection.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, and he'd written to Eisenhower as well. And this sense of, okay, so I have this ability to change the world. I mean, it's interesting, John Steele says, if you didn't know him, if you didn't know his work, you just think he was delusional. This kind of old guy with the shock of grey hair.
Walking on New York streets, in his shorts.
Basically saying, look, I have the key to the world's health. I mean, it's kind of, and when the president hears, everything will change. So if you didn't know his work, of course, you might be surprised about those things. But that pattern of, there's an interesting story in John Steele's book about one of the people in the inner circle hooking him up with Hans Strauss, who was this very eminent person in sports medicine. Big opportunity, late 50s, and he comes to the studio, meets Joe. Joe shakes his hand and says, I never knew you were so small, and then walks off.
Oh my God.
So it's self-destructive. And that's from a point of view of a therapy point of view, these are indicators. Something's going on for this person. Something's happening for them behaviorally. And as we kind of try and unpack that a little more, what we see is these.
Had he lost hope at that point?
Well, I think he was very, very angry. I think he was very angry about how he'd been treated. I think he thought everybody was idiots. And this word comes up again, this idea of this kind of rebuking of people. The idea that basically everybody else is an idiot, but actually, if only they listened, then actually things would be better. So the article, I think, Robert Wernick article, 1962, the Sports Illustrated piece,
right,
is really interesting because this is 62, and there's some lines in that where Wernick's interviewing him, and he's saying, look out the window, look at all those Americans,
fat,
they're bent over,
horrible posture,
young men with grey faces. And there's kind of spitting anger. They play golf, they play baseball, they use half of their muscles, a quarter of the muscles. They get fat, they go jogging, they go on crazy diets, they jump up and down in crazy exercises, they have bad backs, they have beer bellies, they slouch and complain, they have hernias. There's this kind of torrent of anger directed at the outside world because of that frustration. And because his coping style was always to go back to his body. At this point, he can't body his way out of it. This is a psychological challenge now about how he sees himself, how he sees the world, and how he sees other people. And I think that caused him distress. It caused him distress in relationships with people who were trying to support him and were bemused by what was going on. It became self-sabotaging because, that sense of the injustice of it was overwhelming. And I think it made him unhappy. And again, I think that's the sadness of it, which is he did create something rather amazing. And perhaps if he had been less spiky, then also he might have been able to embrace some of the people helping him more in his lifetime.
It would have helped if he had better verbal skills.
Yeah. And that sense of, the anger overwhelming. So there's a nice line in John Steele's book, deep down an angry man, angry at the medical profession for not seeing Contrology as the most effective medicine. He simply couldn't understand that anybody who professed to know the human body and was committed to caring for it didn't instantly recognize that exercise, particularly his series of exercises, was the cure-all.
Yeah.
So that sense, the sense of anger, and it intensifies. So it intensifies over the years. So you get to the end of his life, and he's on his deathbed, really. And John Steele's the last non-medical person to see him. And even then he's fighting, and he says in the book, he's dying in his hospital bed, punching statements out like a boxer.
Yes.
He can't stop fighting. And he says, doctors reject my system because they know it will work and they'll be out of business. No sickness, no patients, no money. This sense of indifference from the medical profession, a bunch of greedy blockheads seeking only to keep people ill.
Yes.
He's pissed off, basically.
He's speaking the truth.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because at the same time, there's people that are trying still to get him into that community. And we take again the Hans Kraus example, that even at that point, people are trying to help him. There's people all along the way, these committees that are forming that are trying to help make it mainstream and, create opportunities and bring him in front of people of influence. And then he's being awkward and difficult and pugnacious and fighting. And it's that, I think, there's a nice thing about where people say to him about doctors, and he says, look, I don't go to doctors, doctors come to me.
Oh my God, that is a great line.
So, the idea that he would have gone to see somebody, he would have gone for therapy, I think is,
Antithesis of
yeah, I mean,
praise.
it's a bit of wishful thinking, but I think it would have helped him to be able to perhaps, rather than deny and suppress that anger, because when you do that, there's a saying in psychology, what you resist persists and what you accept dissolves. So he couldn't verbalize it. And again, there's another thing in psychology, what you can't say to others, you can't say to yourself. He couldn't verbalize the fact that actually perhaps this anger that was inside him was
Holding him back.
was something other than just what it is, rather than maybe I need to get a grip on this, maybe it's not helping me. He didn't have that
Insight?
did he have the insight, or did he choose to ignore it, or he got so used to pushing emotion aside? And it's interesting again, John Steele has spent a lot of time with him and with Clara, said actually in terms of emotions, they didn't really talk about them. They were very matter of fact, they were very practical. There wasn't really any kind of emotional conversation, which would be absolutely right for that time. People perhaps weren't in touch with their emotions or saw them as weakness or whatever. So if he had insight into it, maybe he didn't give it any validity. And in fact, in his life, when he'd faced adversities, again, he'd always gone back to the body. He'd always gone back to exercise. And I think in his mind, if a healthy body was healthy, then the mind followed. So it was incongruent then that he could have a healthy body, but his mind was struggling. And in fact, I think the impact of his mind struggling was his body started to become less healthy. There's stories of smoking more and drinking more. So he's maladaptively coping with the distress. And it's having an effect because the two aren't separate, that mind and body are deeply interconnected. So I think yes, he answered the question. At that point, I think when that rebuke happened with the doctors and he was feeling a lot of pain, I think psychically, I think if he'd been able to sit down with somebody there and say, look, I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling to get over it. I'm noticing I'm drinking more. I'm noticing I'm not sleeping as well. I'm noticing what's worked for me in the past isn't helping. I'm noticing that I'm conflicting with people that I normally, okay, I might be spiky, but I'm really beginning to conflict with people and they're beginning to avoid me, which is what's happening. What can I do?
How would you have answered him?
Well, I think, again, it's really understanding the history a bit more, understanding that sense of his frame of reference and really trying to get inside those beliefs. And then it's really starting to unpack the beliefs and lay the beliefs out. So, one of the things that's often used is this idea of the airing cupboard, right? I don't know if the airing cupboard, you have that in America? It's like a cupboard where your boiler is, where you put clothes to kind of, like a linen cupboard or a laundry cupboard.
Okay.
Somewhere where you might stack clothes,
Okay.
clothes and sheets and so on. So it's the idea that, we accumulate things in life. We kind of shove them in a cupboard, right? Actually, what happens is the cupboard becomes so overflowing that we almost kind of have to hold it shut. We've got a hand on the door to stop it.
Oh, that's a great visual.
And actually, that means that we're tied to the door. We can't really move further out than our reach. And therapy sometimes is about you opening the door and you start to unpack everything. And I don't need that. And actually, that's out of date. And that was useful then. And actually, I just order this differently. And I can shut the door and I can move on. And I think, there's laying out these beliefs and these experiences and understanding what's going on for him. How's it affecting him? And then, I think working to make some of these things more balanced. So working through some of the distortions that are taking place, because clearly he's built up this very clear sense of the world is against me. So maybe, and a lot of the positives, the lens has changed. So a lot of the positives here, the fact that
Disappeared.
Yeah, the fact that he's got all these people that think he's great, the fact he's done some amazing work, the fact he's changing lives, all of that is disqualified. He's minimizing all of that. He's catastrophizing about everything is terrible. He's very negatively focused. There's a lot of negative bias taking place, cognitively. I think there's a lack of compassion maybe for other people, a lack of compassion for himself, certainly. And the gap between his intentions and his impact are widening. And that's a really interesting sign, I think, sometimes of emotional distress. I don't mean to hurt people, but I really am. The impact is not what I intend. So I think it would be a process of exploring his beliefs and working through them. I think it would be a process of compassion and helping him perhaps to reframe the way he sees the world in terms of his place in it and also what he's achieved. So get a better sense of achievement.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, he might reevaluate some of those relationships and consider taking some different courses in them. And also, I think, and again, this is where the mind links to the body. There's also something about helping him to return to that sense of his own
Return to health.
physical. Yes, because, for instance, he's going up to Jacob's Well, isn't he? And actually he finds a lot of solace there. And he's doing less and less in the gym. And actually, in a sense, how do we get a succession that works here, Joe? So you can enjoy the time at Jacob's Well, because that succession issue is a big deal. And of course, the succession is massively blocked by the fact that he doesn't want a woman to succeed him. And a lot of that, again, is maybe historical and of the time, but actually the community is full of very strong, capable women. I mean, really,
Definitely.
And, so, and Romana kind of comes into the picture, doesn't she, later and almost accidentally, when perhaps she might have come sooner and more intentionally, or Carola Trier or Eve Gentry or whoever it was. So I think yes, there's something about helping him to see where he is, build his insight, give him some more awareness, help him to get a greater sense of control, really then think about those relationships, how he returns them to an order, how he channels that aggression healthily, and how he has more, if you like, impact in line with his intention. And I think that's...
And give him permission. He needed to have someone give him permission to embody all the success and all that he had been doing. But he probably didn't get that kind of feedback growing up. So he doesn't know that it's okay to be happy and feel accomplished with what you've done, what you've achieved. He didn't have that peace in him. All he knew was to push, push, push.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that sense of what is it like not to fight? Because actually what it became was very dichotomous for him, which was I'm fighting or I'm losing. I'm fighting or I'm losing. And there was no...
middle. There's
no middle. And from the point of view of stress, if you think about the stress that's causing in kind of theory land, we think of allostasis. Allostasis is this idea of our adaptability to change. So when we're presented with change, how does our body respond to it? How much cortisol do we release?
Right.
How much adrenaline, how much epinephrine, all these things, okay? And actually, as we accumulate wear and tear, then we call that allostatic load. So allostatic load, as allostasis is the normal ability to respond to change. Allostatic load, we're starting to accumulate wear and tear. When we go into allostatic overload, that's where we start to really create some damage. We kind of get locked in these activated zones, sympathetic. If you think about the nervous system, we get locked into fight flight. And actually, when we get to allostatic overload, what we're starting to do is to really start to see some kind of impact on the body, because we're in that kind of reasonably toxic space. And I think, again, how does he get back to allostasis? How does he get back to healthy adaptability? So this is where the psychology and the body work comes in. And at this point in his life, he'd done the body work. It worked really well in resetting him all his life, but now he needed a bit more. And in his life, you can see that's what happens to a lot of people's lives, that these things become out of balance.
Hey, everyone. Want to level up your teaser? When I'm not interviewing or editing, I'm helping students just like you get to the next level. If you'd like to understand the Contrology technique, come learn from me, whether online or in person. Just know I'm here and happy to help. Now, back to the interview. How do you think Contrology would dovetail into trauma therapy? Would there be, speaking of insurance, for example, can you imagine one day that Contrology would be part of the educational process?
Yeah, I think in trauma, the polyvagal theory is becoming very popular in trauma work.
Explain that.
Yeah, so polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges is the Professor Stephen Porges. So it's his work, and he looks at the autonomic nervous system and these different branches of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve being this, literally
longest nerve.
Yeah, longest nerve is wandering nerve, I think is vagus in Latin. And his work, really the breakthrough of his work was to see these different levels of the vagus nerve. So people had talked about rest, digest, so that idea of, the ventral vagus, he calls it. So calm, connected, safe, engaged. The other counterpoint to that was fight, flight, rest, digest, fight, flight. So that's parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system. People have really talked about those two states. What he introduced was the idea of the dorsal vagal, which is this shutdown response. And often you see that in trauma because people's ability to deal with a situation in the moment is overwhelmed. And their response then is to shut down. Particularly you see that in the types of abuse. So The key in trauma is how do you help people return to that calm, connected, safe, engaged space? When you're traumatized, the switch becomes quicker. So you move out of that safe state more quickly. You become hypervigilant, so you're on the lookout for danger. You become more avoidant. Your sleep becomes disturbed. Your relationships can become strained. Your self-concept becomes eroded. You beat yourself up a lot. And the antidote to that, in many ways, is the return to that sense of safety and connection. And for me, from a trauma perspective, then, Contrology or Pilates is fantastic for that because it's fundamentally a return to that ventral vagal state. It's helping you to feel safe, helping you to feel connected. Now you're connected with a community, with a group of people, but you're also connected to your own body. And if you think about the elements, the mindfulness, the movement, the breathing, the routine, the precision, the control, the elements of Pilates are fantastic ways in which we can return to that sense of safety and return to a sense of connection.
Do you see yourself teaching one day Contrology to other psychotherapists so that they could add this element into their practice? Do you see there would be a possibility?
Well, I'm interested in actually, I suppose, working with people that are very good at Pilates to see how we do that polyvagal integration, and this idea of polyvagal Pilates. So where we take the elements of polyvagal theory and we bring it together with Pilates. And actually, that isn't just about trauma. It's also about this idea of protective factors. So, this idea that we all have a stress jar. This is a theory from a lady called Janine Austin, who's a professor of psychiatric genetics. She talks about a jam jar. We all have a jam jar, mental health jam jar. And in that jam jar, we have genetics, which we can't do an awful lot about. And then we have environmental factors. As that jar fills with environmental factors, the risk is it overflows. We go into that allostatic overload, we break down, okay? And her antidote to that is often the environmental factors we can't change. We couldn't change COVID. We can't change the economy. We can't change the wars that are going on. What we can do is we can increase the capacity of the jar. And she calls that protective factors. And for me, Pilates is a fantastic protective factor because it returns us to safety. It returns us into that ventral vagal state where essentially our body is replenishing. So I think there's a place in trauma, but trauma is quite a specialist thing. But actually the stress that's in this society that potentially becomes traumatic, that certainly becomes eroding, there's a huge place for polyvagal Pilates and Pilates, more broadly in helping people
not even
replenish.
Get to that end stage where they shut down.
Yeah, because that was the experience of this lady I was telling you about in the studio I go to. She came in and she was becoming dysregulated. I can't sleep at the moment. It was so full of worry. I could feel it in my tummy. She does an hour of Pilates and she says, this is helping me cope. I feel so much better. Actually, I'm feeling like I can cope with the day. I feel like I'm recovering. So that's anecdotal, right? But the more evidence we can grow for that, the better. And that's, in a sense, is Joe's legacy. Joe's whole thing was the medical profession don't listen. And maybe as a community, we have the opportunity to
wake them up,
fit that final piece in the puzzle and say, well, look, here's the evidence that this really does help people, as I say, recover from traumatic events, but also helps them to manage life stress so they don't break down. And that's the power of it. So yes, I think in a sense, as a community, maybe that's an important step for us to build that evidence base. And in England, we have social prescribing, and certainly that's something we've taken from Norway, the Scandinavian countries, from Japan, where doctors will prescribe activities like Pilates, like forest bathing, like yoga, like wild water swimming, like mountain trails. They'll prescribe that rather than going for a medical prescription.
Oh my gosh, I don't know how that would ever happen here without Big Pharma sticking its hands everywhere.
Well, it's this thing, isn't it? Everything has a code. I mean, that's what I've learned about the American system. There's a code for everything. So the task is to get this coded. Once it's coded, it exists in the world. And that was Joe's challenge. It wasn't coded, and it wasn't coded because he wasn't seen as being valid by the medical establishment. And the way the medical establishment really prove validity is through evidence and status. So, perhaps there's more status around Pilates now, but have we got enough evidence? If we can get that, then maybe.
Oh, I'm sure there's tons of evidence.
Yeah, exactly. And this is such a great platform to to think about how to pull the evidence together and to build those connections. Because, actually, I'd love to see this prescribed socially. I prescribe it to my patients, my clients.
You do now?
Oh, all the time, yeah. Because it's you can't just you can't disaggregate mind from body. It has to be holistic. It has to be integrated, and that ability to reconnect and to feel the safety and connection, to get back into that zone, get back in the green zone, if you like, is really important.
Well, if one of your patients, do you say patients or clients?
In the health service, I say patients, and generally I'd say clients. Yeah, so somewhere in between the two.
If they have never heard of the Pilates method, how do you describe it to him or her?
Well, I talk about the fact that it's an opportunity for people to get in touch with their bodies again, to build community, to do an exercise, to find a way to become mindful in the moment, to focus on their breath, to think about movement and breathing and flow and precision and control. So I'm selling it in that way. I like that John Howard Steele definition. I think that's something really strong in that. He said, Pilates is a system of coordinated movement, concentration, and breathing that fully absorbs the actor in what he or she is doing, adds grace and efficiency to daily life, relieves stress, increases circulation, augments self-esteem, becomes a habit, and most importantly, is fun to do. And he much more articulately describes it than I do. And it's lovely that because it contains all those elements, the relieving of stress, the habit, the connection, the physical circulatory benefits, self-esteem, and the fact it's fun, the fact that you come out of I never had a bad...
Happy. Yeah.
I never had a bad session. I've gone into sessions feeling miserable, but I always come out actually feeling happy. Even if it's, challenging, I find that my mood improves.
Maybe you could have a poster of what you just shared with us and have it in your office.
It's lovely I think it's a great definition. Really,
Perfect.
It does capture it well. So yes, there's lots of opportunity, and I think again, to get to that point where we could socially prescribe Pilates would be fantastic.
Agreed. Let me ask you on that note, any parting words or advice that you can share for those who do have buried trauma and they don't feel capable of dealing with them? Do you have anything that you can say to those people listening?
Yeah, I think hope and recovery is really important, and sometimes the people I work with will say, can it get better? Is there hope? And hope's a really important human characteristic, perhaps one of the most important. And there's hope in working with people who can help you. There's hope in recognizing there's choices you can make too. And there's hope in a compassion that allows you to see that actually the traumatic experiences you've had don't have to define your life. So I think that the ability to take hope and do something with it is really powerful. And certainly this is part of the piece. And I think that decision sometimes to, how do I make a change? How do I go about embarking on this? It's often very hard. Maybe something's been affecting me for years. Where do I start? It can take time to find the right person. But if you see this as part of the piece, I think food's important. I think exercise is important. I think sleep's important. I think, social connection's important. I think how we talk to ourselves is important. They're all attributes that can help. It's making a start. And if making a start is you go in a Pilates studio, that's making a start. Making a start is picking up the phone and writing an email, that's a start. If making a start is I'm going to be kind to myself today, it's a start. So, have hope and make a start.
I love it. That's beautiful advice and guidance. Thank you, Gareth. I know you had a question for me that you would like to ask.
I might have a few up my sleeve.
Oh, no. Okay.
He says, pulling out his list of questions. So, obviously I came to this and this conversation came about because I was a listener, and I love the podcast and I walk every night. So I have my dinner and then I walk, or sometimes I walk with my wife and, sometimes I walk as a family, but, oftentimes I'll poodle around the block in the rain on my own. And then I'll put my podcast in, and the amount of times that walk has been listening to you and coming back and getting a piece of paper out and scribbling something down. So it's great, and I love the podcast. And I suppose the first question, which I never heard answered, is really how you came to the idea of the podcast. How did it come about?
Oh, the podcast was definitely not my idea. It was one of my students and colleagues, Sonia Lopez. It all started with my wanting to share my thoughts and to educate the public basically on what I deemed two very strong, very different approaches to Joe's work. And I had the opportunity when I moved from Southern California to Northern California. I had met the executive director for a local radio station. And he said to me, well, as we were talking, I was mostly talking. He was listening as I was sharing about Pilates. Because at that point, when I first moved up here, there was no classical, there was no traditional. It was only this very interesting, unrecognizable approach to Joe's work. And for someone like me who was at Drago's and worked on his equipment and was around people who you could feel Joe there, you could feel his spirit and you could feel it in the movement and the exercises you were doing. It just was so clear. So I took that with me. And then when I moved up to Northern California, I basically didn't recognize how people were being taught this work. So as I was having this kind of conversation with the executive director, and he suggested I have this radio show, I thought, okay, I know how to be in front of a mic. I had produced my apps and I voiced all of the instructions. So I had a show at 2 p.m. every Sunday, which means I had to write the script and I had to come up with a guest every single Sunday. There's a lot of pressure on me. I don't even know how I did it, but it was definitely boot camp for sure. And as I was having this experience, I was learning how to edit.
Yeah, I bet.
I didn't at that point. I don't think podcasts were definitely not on my radar. And then at some point, one of my students, Sonia, she sort of demanded, she didn't even say, what do you think? She just said, you need to do a podcast. I think this was around when we started hearing hints of COVID. And I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know. It was already very overwhelming to be writing a script and finding a guest and dealing with the guest personalities, which there are many, and having them call into the station. This is all live. So there was a lot, talk about stress. But I felt very compelled, like it was my responsibility to educate the public about who this man was, as far as I knew at that time. Not that people were getting it wrong, but they just weren't exactly getting it right. And at some point when I had this conversation with Sonia, she, I guess, kind of convinced me. And I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And so that's how it started. I've certainly grown a lot in 6 seasons, and I feel more competent and capable of finding the guests unless someone like you reaches out to me and having this kind of platform. So Zoom has afforded me the space and the time to get to know my guest. That's one reason why I have my pre-interview, and then to check audio. Then by the time we have the interview, there's already a nice rapport, usually. So I hope that my podcast is helping people like you understand and learn from the different educators in this community. There are so many different lenses in which we view this work. It's kind of astounding.
Yeah, no, and actually as a listener, that sense of the diversity of perspectives, it really is, because it isn't just thinking about Pilates, it's also thinking about the context in which it happens and the history of it and the opportunities around it and the differences it makes and the specifics of practice and how to build studios and the whole range. So I think it's a great repository of information and insight. And now, so how many countries are you reaching?
I think it's 89 now.
Wow. Okay. You're a global superstar. Huh?
I had no idea until Buzzsprout last year or 2 seasons ago. I think they started doing this. They would have a chart and have different categories. And one of the categories was the different countries. And when I saw 87 at the time, I thought, wow, 87 countries. It's just, it warmed my heart because it gave me a lot of validation, a lot of encouragement to know that I am sharing, at least from my experience, and I hope that I'm asking the right guests on my show, that Joe's message continues to weave throughout the planet. It just gives me a lot of satisfaction knowing that I am, as I always say with my teaching, I'm a conduit. And I feel so happy for him.
Well, and that sense of the need for the work, I think one of the things I hear you repeatedly, talk about through the different podcasts is actually the need for the work, and that sense that in the podcast, you're helping to spread the message of the work, and the fact that people are looking for it in all those countries tells you that there's a need that people are trying to find.
And a curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the bottom line is people want to feel good. They want to feel healthy. Here's a system that will do it.
Yeah.
Romana used to say, and I've mentioned this before, but she would say bad Pilates is better than no Pilates. I mean, that's maybe a little debatable for those of us who are technicians, but it is true because we start to move. Just like we've been talking about, your mind gets so immersed in what the body is feeling. You do have this whole body experience, which is what he wanted. And then we have the spiritual piece, because eventually people become kinder and more grounded because they're connected.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There's the return to green. Yeah, your return to safe.
Return to safety. Yes.
And so 100 episodes in, what do you think, what changes do you think you've made to your life? I mean, has this had an impact in terms of how you live your life? Have you picked up information? What difference has it made?
Oh, I think before my podcast, I didn't really know all the players in the community. That's for sure. I didn't really know the impact of the other first generation teachers as I do now because of the guests that I've had on. So they've enriched my life and have helped me feel more confident about what I'm doing.
Yeah. And is there a memorable guest, I suppose, out of that 100? And I know it's
my gosh.
Is there one where you think actually, that episode is worth, I come off this call and put that one on, and which one does one to spring to mind?
Oh, wow. Well, I think maybe Roberta Kirschenbaum, because she had Joe's studio, and it felt like there was a connection from her because she's in his space.
Yeah.
And it gave a sense of history, and she's so humble about how she talked about her studio and just seeing the rent sign when she would walk up and down 8th Avenue and that experience. So that sticks out because it's real. There's his studio. It's still a Pilates studio in 2024.
I wonder what you think of the landscape. Because the thing is, you probably walk out of that studio now and up and down. I mean, the amount of Pilates studios that are around, quite amazing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And so then the next 100, then what's your ambition?
Oh, wow. Am I going to last 100 more episodes?
You will, and you need to.
I need to. Well, I would have to say that I would love my podcast to continue to be one of those hubs where people know, whether they're teachers or students or just Pilates enthusiasts, they know that they can go to All Things Pilates, listen when they're walking in the rain with their doggy or whatever, and they'll finish that episode. They'll learn something for sure. They'll be inspired. They'll be motivated. They'll be educated. I would love to know that my podcast would continue to have that kind of impact.
Yeah. Well, 87 countries. If we can talk when we get to 200 and see how many countries, how many listeners, and more reflections.
Okay.
But here's the first 100, and I know on behalf of probably everybody else that listens, it's fantastic and really enjoyable and transformative in many ways. So thank you.
I hope so. Thank you. And thank you for your time and all your expertise and knowledge about the inner workings of our mind, because we so have the We have the chance, the opportunity to be whole and to heal the world. We do. We have it in us.
Well, and you know, Pilates is such a powerful force, I think, for healing, you know, and for bringing people together positively. And that constructive emotion, joy, happiness, really, really feeling alive in the world. So he's hoping. Now, in terms of gathering information, I'm really keen if anybody's got anecdotal stories or information that they want to share to try and capture some of that. And obviously I can kind of keep you updated on that too.
Yes, please.
As we go along. So I've got an email address I can provide if that's helpful.
Yes.
Yeah, so if anybody's interested in sharing their stories or anecdotes, then they can send it to me at pilates.evidence@outlook.com. And then hopefully I'll kind of collate that information and obviously give you the link back. And we'll see if we can build up a little bit of a repository of insights, anecdotes, experiences, positive things that show the powerful influence of Pilates in helping people to recover from life challenges, stress, adversity, traumas, and so on.
Wonderful. So you're asking listeners to share their Pilates stories of healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And let's see, because that evidence base, you know, I think that's, if we could get to the point where we can have that social prescription, you know, where people can go to their physician and the physician gives them that choice, gives them that option, rather than, you know, a medicated solution, or maybe as well as a medicated solution, that would be immense. And I think that, in a sense, is perhaps part of what Joe was hoping for, you know, in those letters that he was writing to Kennedy and to Eisenhower and to luminaries. It was always about this method has
partnering with other modalities.
Absolutely, and the potential to, like you just said, you know, actually heal and make the world healthier and bring people together. So, you know, any information people want to share.
Especially now.
Really, yeah. And I think that's, again, I mean, there's a lot of, we think about anger, you know, there's a lot of
rage, not anger, rage.
You know, and that destructive anger, right?
Can you imagine if all that energy was channeled into something like what we're talking about?
Yeah, it would be.
Wow.
Yeah. And imagine the difference it could make positively to people's lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. I appreciate it. Congratulations again. I hope you're having a party.
I haven't thought about it, but I think maybe I will. That's a good idea.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. All Things Pilates is produced, written, edited, and hosted by me, Darian Gold. Mastered audio mix, Fabian Romero. Original music, a.k.a. Johnny. And we'd love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. That way you let all of us know what you like about All Things Pilates. Also, if you're interested in helping to support this podcast, become a subscriber. It helps to cover all the back-end costs that accrue when producing a show. To learn more about how you can be part of our growing community, check out our show notes. There are no little events in life. Those we think of no consequence may be full of fate. And it is at our risk if we neglect the acquaintances and opportunities that seem to be casually offered and of small importance. Amelia E. Barr.